Hello, my name is Linda and welcome to Rhythm of Life. Our reading today is Mark chapter 10, verses 46 to 52. Jesus heals a blind beggar. Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called to the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked him. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus, "your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. Amen. What do you desire? It's a question which can set our minds racing. What do you desire? We've all heard stories of a genie in the lamp. You rub and you're granted 3 wishes by the freed genie. The person who's rubbed the lamp is normally so surprised or sceptical that they flippantly ask for something and then have to use their second wish to undo the first. Or even worse. A poor, starving peasant couple are granted 3 wishes, and the woman, just taking the first thing that comes to her mind, wishes for a sausage, which she receives immediately. Her husband, pointing out that she could have wished for immense wealth or food to last them a lifetime, becomes angry with her for making such a stupid wish, and not thinking, wishes the sausage was stuck on her nose. Sure enough, the sausage is stuck in the middle of her face, and then they have to use the 3rd wish to make it go away, upon which the sausage and the genie disappear completely. But Jesus here is only giving Bartimaeus 1 chance, a chance for the man to turn his life around. We all have things we want. The question here isn't just what do you want, but what is it that you desire? What is really important? I want you to imagine that Jesus is just about to walk up to you and ask you that very question. What do you want me to do for you? What would you say? Would you ask for world peace, for the end of social injustice, for the end of world poverty? Or would it be something more personal? Would you give him a list of problems in your life that needed to be solved? Would you ask him for a more successful career, a bigger home, financial security for you and your family? Would you ask him for physical or mental healing? What if, like blind Bartimaeus, you had 1 opportunity to let him know about the most pressing thing in your life? What would it be? Here we have a blind man called Bartimaeus, sitting by the roadside, having to beg. Jewish law didn't address begging because there should have been no need for it. If people took care of their family members the way the law instructed, no one would need to beg. Yet, here we have a blind beggar on the edge of a road. Beggars would have been a common sight back then in most towns. In fact, this event told in Matthew's Gospel tells of 2 blind beggars being healed that day, not just Bartimaeus. Most occupations required physical labour, and anyone with a disability was usually cast out and forced to beg, as families couldn't afford to keep them. Because they couldn't work, they brought no money in. There were no welfare programmes or charitable institutions that would help them, so beggars had little hope of escaping this way of life. We're told that he was son of Timaeus, and that name meant honour. Timaeus wasn't a Jewish but a Greek name. Therefore, it's possible that the beggar's father was a Greek, perhaps married to a Jewish woman. And he obviously wasn't bringing much honour to the family as he was having to live on the streets. Bartimaeus was sitting outside the city of Jericho on the road that led to Jerusalem. Every day he would sit there at the side of the road begging for money and food from passers-by. Bartimaeus would have heard people talking as he was sitting there day in, day out. He would have heard what was going on locally, the news of what was happening. He no doubt would have heard travellers talking about this miracle worker named Jesus. He may have heard about lepers being healed, the lame walking, about demons fleeing, the dead being raised, and the blind seeing. And this day was different. The crowd was much larger than usual. Bartimaeus could hear excited voices. He realized that Jesus must be in Jericho, and then heard that Jesus was coming this way. We don't know how long he'd been blind, but it only took a moment for him to decide to call to Jesus for help. Jesus and his disciples were heading west out of Jericho on their way to Jerusalem, about 15 miles away on the dangerous road where the Good Samaritan story had taken place, and many people had chosen to follow them. Bartimaeus saw an opportunity of a lifetime. He wasn't going to let anyone stop him. He'd heard of the miracles Jesus had performed. He heard the Son of David was passing by, the Messiah. Now it was his one opportunity. Imagine the noise around Jesus at the time as he was walking along the road. There was a crowd following Jesus, no doubt pushing and talking among themselves. Perhaps some were asking him questions. The road would have also had other beggars on it who were calling out to people as they passed by. Bartimaeus no doubt had to shout to make himself heard. And so he began to shamelessly shout out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Son of David was the title for the Messiah, commonly used in those days. He was a beggar, but when Jesus came by, he stopped asking for money and instead asked for mercy. He didn't want a handout. He didn't ask for Jesus' pity, but for mercy. People attempted to quieten Bartimaeus. He would have been seen as an outcast in society, cursed according to Jewish tradition. Any disability was considered a punishment by God. Perhaps some were embarrassed by his appearance or his smell. He wouldn't have been able to wash his clothes properly or even clean himself. Some may have been uncomfortable with the sacrilegious reference to Jesus being called the Messiah. Remember, there were those by this time who were plotting to have him killed. Some may have said, "This is the Messiah, you're just a blind beggar, leave him alone. He has important business to attend to." The closest followers of Jesus were no doubt telling Bartimaeus to be quiet, to leave their master alone. The very people who wanted to be closest to Jesus were the same people who were keeping others away from him. But Bartimaeus knew something the disciples apparently didn't yet understand. He knew who Jesus really was. Jesus had recently asked his disciples, James and John, the same question he was about to ask Bartimaeus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Unlike the disciples, Bartimaeus recognized Jesus as the Messiah for who he really was. He recognized the hope that could be found in him. He knew that Jesus had the authority and power to heal, and healing was what Bartimaeus wanted. He was blind, but he had a desire to see. He was blind, but he saw what others were blind to. Bartimaeus wouldn't be silent. His faith was undeterred. Now he called out to Jesus with complete faith that this teacher could and would heal him. We're told that he cried out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And in the midst of this noise, Jesus heard the call and it stopped him in his tracks. Here in this crowd was someone who believed that he was the Messiah and was worshipping him, calling out for mercy. However, Jesus didn't go over to Bartimaeus. Instead, he told others to tell him that he wanted the beggar to come to him. So they called the blind man over, and Bartimaeus jumped up, throwing off his cloak. The cloak would probably have had several pockets to place his money as it was given to him. Throwing aside his cloak would have also thrown aside any money he'd collected, and I'm sure there were those who eagerly grabbed the cloak and the money. And the cloak was probably all he possessed. It was what kept him warm at night. It might have been the only thing that was truly his. It was no doubt a bit cumbersome and weighty, though, and so when Jesus said, "Come to me," he threw it aside, not thinking of the consequences, and jumped up. You can imagine him stumbling his way towards Jesus. It's dangerous for a blind man to run anywhere, but this couldn't wait. The beggar realized that this was the day of his greatest opportunity to be healed. And so Jesus called him over and asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" Bartimaeus answered, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "I want to see." It's interesting that Jesus asked such a question, isn't it? Because surely it was obvious what the blind man wanted. But think about it. With sight would come responsibility. No more begging. He'd have to find a job. He would have to take care of himself. His entire lifestyle would change. But Bartimaeus went bold and took the risk and dared to think big. He knew it would be worth it. He came with honesty and sincerity. "Rabbi, I want to see." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has healed you." And immediately he received his sight. But Bartimaeus didn't go on his way, but instead followed Jesus. His faith in Jesus as the Messiah is what healed him, both physically and spiritually. Mark's language reveals that Jesus took away the blindness of his eyes and of his heart. Bartimaeus got what he asked for, but with his change in life, it was evident that he received much more than just his sight. So, if you saw Jesus walking down the road, what would you do? Would you stay quiet or shout out? There perhaps will be many reasons why you wouldn't want to cry out to Jesus today. Some of them will be emotional. Some will sound reasonable. Some will seem to be religious. Perhaps you think you're not worthy. But if you have a chance to be made whole, to be healed, to be forgiven, to grow closer to God, then shouldn't you cry out all the louder? He will hear you. And Jesus didn't just call Bartimaeus to himself. He said to his disciples, "Bring him to me." This is the call of God on our lives today. Jesus says, "Bring people to me." Just tell them I am calling and let them come themselves to me. This passage is all about the call of discipleship. It's interesting that of all the people we read about where Jesus performed miracles and they aren't named, that Mark chose to name this blind beggar. It got me thinking, what is different about Bartimaeus for Mark to do this? It must be something significant. Well, for me, it's that Jesus asked his disciples to call him over. Then after the miracle was performed, after he was given his sight, Bartimaeus followed Jesus. Jesus didn't ask the disciples to perform any miracle, just to bring the blind man to him. And likewise with us, Jesus doesn't ask us to do anything but to bring people to him, to let people know about Jesus. And if they call out, he will do the rest. We don't have to perform anything miraculous. This is discipleship. When Jesus said, "Call him over here," he was reminding the disciples that following means inviting others to follow. It means welcoming others into the group. It means making room for someone who was an outsider and inviting that person to become an insider. So I'll ask you again, if Jesus asked the same question of you, "What do you want me to do for you?" what would you say? For many of us, we would find it hard to choose just one thing. If we did, we may then regret that we didn't choose something else when that something else came up. But perhaps the one thing we should all cry out for is, I want to see. I'm not talking about physical blindness, but spiritual blindness. Jesus met many spiritually blind people, religious leaders, people in the crowd. In what ways are we blind to God's kingdom? How have we lost our vision? How do our ideas of who belongs in church prevent us from seeing the blind Bartimaeuses around us, the people on the margins who want to be healed by God's mercy? And I'm not just talking about society's outcast. Most people don't come to church. We see that in our declining numbers. From recent surveys done, most people in the West today will say they aren't affiliated to any faith, but increasingly people are spiritually curious. And it's these people that we also need to be reaching out to. It's one of the reasons why we're building the community garden and running the community cafe at Moor Lane every Monday, to reach out to our neighbours and to start engaging with them, asking what can we do for them. Jesus doesn't call us to perform miracles, but he does call us to tell others about him. And if people aren't coming into church buildings, then shouldn't we be going out to them? Like Bartimaeus, shouldn't we be bold and take a risk? Dare to do something different? When the world tells you to be quiet, be persistent. When your prayers aren't answered quickly, be persistent. We need Bartimaeus' boldness. We have to overcome our doubts and respond in faith. Like Bartimaeus, Jesus will hear the cries of anyone who calls out to him, and he will respond with mercy and grace. My challenge to you today is that all of us would have the courage to take a good look at our lives and see what God sees. And, like Bartimaeus, to ask ourselves, is this the life that I really want? Am I going to be satisfied with this life as I have it? Bartimaeus realized his blindness and stopped making excuses for his situation. He stopped pretending that his life was okay like it was. He faced his reality and took a risk, a leap of faith. Dare we do the same? Do we dare as a church to move away from our traditions? Dare you do something different for Jesus? Amen. Thank you.